3 weeks after my daughter, her husband, and my 7-year-old granddaughter moved into the house I have owned free and clear since 1988, I stood outside my own laundry room and listened to him teaching that little girl to say I was losing my mind. Not shouting, not angry, patient, the way you'd teach a child to tie a shoe. When I told him to stop, he looked at me with real pity and said, "Ray, this is exactly what we're worried about." My daughter said nothing. Then he told me that if I couldn't be reasonable, maybe I should stay somewhere else for a while. He'd forgotten whose name is on the deed. Welcome in, friends. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what city and what country you're listening from. I read every one of them, and I mean that. Some elements of this story have been shaped for the telling, and names and places are their own invention, but what it leaves in you is not invented at all. My name is Ray Whitaker. I am 71 years old, and for 34 years, I was an official court reporter in the district courthouse downtown. I sat 6 feet from the witness stand, and I wrote down what people actually said, syllable by syllable, while they were saying it. Not what they meant, not what they wished they'd said, what came out of their mouths. That job taught me one thing so thoroughly that it became part of my spine. Memory is soft, and the record is hard, and the person holding the record is the person who decides what happened. I live on Kettle Ridge Road in Duluth, Minnesota, in a brick and cedar house my wife and I bought in the spring of 1988, back when the maple out front was a sapling I could circle with 2 hands. Now that maple drops enough leaves each October to fill 16 bags, and I still do all 16 myself. My wife's name was Arlene. She was a school librarian for 29 years, and she died 7 years ago in March, and I am not going to pretend I have made peace with it. People tell you grief gets lighter. What actually happens is you get stronger in one specific set of muscles and weaker everywhere else. She planted lilacs along the north fence in 1991 because she said a house without something fragrant in June is just a building. Those lilacs are still there. They come in every year without asking me for anything, and every year in June I stand out there for a while like a fool. For 6 years I lived alone in that house. Coffee at 5:40, the wood stove, from October through April. The sound of the lake when the wind came from the right direction. Some people would call it lonely. I called it quiet, and there's a difference, and the difference matters. Then, 14 months ago, my daughter Corinne called. She was 39 then, a veterinary technician at a clinic out past the mall, married to Trent Dolan, and the mother of my granddaughter, Junie. Corinne told me they were behind. The car needed a transmission. The rent had gone up twice in a year, and Trent's business was, in her words, in a rebuilding phase. She asked if they could stay with me while they got their footing. 6 months, she said. Maybe 8. I said yes before she'd finished the sentence, and I want to be honest with you, friends. I didn't say yes for Corinne, and I certainly didn't say yes for Trent. I said yes for Junie. That child came through my front door with a plastic chess set under one arm and a composition notebook under the other, and something in my chest that had been sitting very still for 6 years rolled over and woke up. Junie kept lists in that notebook. She called them her true things. Little numbered entries in careful pencil. The lake is colder in July than people think. Mrs. Fontaine sneezes 4 times in a row, never 3. Dad says he'll be home at 6 and comes at 8. That last one, I read over her shoulder once, and then pretended I hadn't. I want to tell you about a morning in early April, before all of this started properly, because I need you to understand what was actually at stake. I was out in the detached garage with the wood stove going and the doors open to the cold, working on Arlene's canoe. It's a 1,962 cedar strip that her father built by hand, and it had been sitting on sawhorses under a tarp since the year she got sick. I'd finally decided to finish it. I heard boots on the gravel. Junie came in, wearing her coat over her pajamas, and my old canvas work gloves, which came up past her elbows and made her look like a small heron. "Grandpa, what's that string?" I was hanging a plumb bob off a nail I'd driven into a ceiling joist, checking whether the sawhorses were sitting true on that sloped concrete floor. "That's a plumb bob," I said. "It's a weight on a string. What's it for?" "It tells you what straight down is. Right there. That line. That's straight down. Always. It doesn't matter what I think, or what the floor thinks, or how tired I am, or how bad I want the floor to be level. I gave it a small nudge and we both watched it swing and settle. It doesn't argue with you, Junie. It just hangs true, and then you know. She considered that with her whole face, the way she considered everything. So, if somebody says the floor is straight and it isn't, the string tells on them. That's about the size of it. She wrote something in the notebook. I didn't ask. She handed me sandpaper when I asked for it, and steel wool when I asked for that. And for about 40 minutes, we didn't say much of anything, and I remember thinking that this was as good as my life was likely to get, and that it was plenty good enough. Then she said, without looking up, "Grandpa, are you going to be old for a long time?" I laughed before I could stop myself. "I'm already old, kiddo. I mean old like you can't do the canoe." I set the block down. "Someday. Not today." "Okay." She nodded once and went back to the sandpaper. "I wrote down that you can still lift the canoe by yourself. So if anybody asks, I didn't think anything of it at the time, friends. I want you to understand that. At the time, I thought it was a 7-year-old being a 7-year-old. It was 3 days later that I found out who had been asking. I'd come in from the garage to get a coffee and I heard Trent's voice from the laundry room, low and warm and unhurried. The door was pushed most of the way shut. I stopped in the hall with a cold mug in my hand and I did not move. "Junie, look at me. This is a grown-up conversation and you're old enough for it. You know Grandpa's been forgetting things." A pause. Then that small voice. "Like what?" "Like the stove. Like leaving the back door unlocked. Like telling you a story twice and not remembering he told it. He doesn't do that. Sweetheart. Gentle. Genuinely gentle. And that's what made my skin crawl. Sometimes when we love somebody, we don't see the hard stuff. That's why grown-ups have to help. Now, if a teacher asks you, or a doctor, or anybody, I want you to tell them Grandpa forgets. Can you do that?" But he doesn't. "Junie." A shift in the voice. Still warm, but with a floor under it now. "You want Grandpa to be safe, don't you? What if he leaves the stove on and there's a fire? Would that be your fault or mine?" "Nothing." Then, very small. "Mine? No, baby. It'd be nobody's fault. But we can stop it before it happens. That's all we're doing. We're helping him. And this is a helping secret, so we don't talk about it with Grandpa, because it would hurt his feelings. Okay? Let's practice. What do you say?" And I heard my granddaughter's voice, flat and careful like a line she'd been given. "Grandpa forgets things." Good girl. I stood in that hallway, friends, and I want to tell you what I felt, but the truth is that what I felt came in layers, and they arrived out of order. There was the heat first, up the back of my neck, then something underneath the heat that felt uncomfortably close to grief, because he was not just lying about me, he was building something inside that child, and she was the material. And then, under all of it, the thing 34 years in a courtroom had put in me. Cold. Procedural. A voice that said, "He is creating a record, and right now, his is the only one." Because I knew exactly what that was. I had transcribed guardianship hearings. Dozens of them. I knew what it looks like when the file is thick and the old man's file is empty. I knew that the person who is declared incapacitated does not get to explain himself, because the fact of the hearing is already half the verdict. I set my mug down on the hall table without a sound. I walked back to the garage. I sat on an overturned bucket next to Arlene's canoe, with my hands on my knees, and I let myself feel the whole weight of it for about 4 minutes. Then I got up and went inside and did the thing I want you to remember me for, if you remember anything about this story at all. I got a legal pad. That evening I waited until Junie was asleep. Corinne was folding towels on the couch. Trent was at the kitchen table with his laptop and his headphones around his neck. "Trent," I said, "this afternoon I heard you in the laundry room with Junie." He closed the laptop halfway, unhurried. "Okay, you told her to tell people I forget things. You told her not to tell me. I'd like that to stop tonight." Corinne's hands stopped moving on the towel. And here's where I learned who I was dealing with. Because Trent Dolan didn't get angry, and he didn't get caught. He got sad. His shoulders came down. His eyebrows went up in the middle. He looked at me like I was a wounded animal on the side of a county road. Ray, he said softly, do you hear how that sounds? I heard what you said. You heard part of a conversation, through a door, and you built a story out of it. He turned to Corinne, and his voice went even quieter, which somehow made it louder. Core, this is the third time this month. That's a lie. See, this is what I mean. He spread his hands. Ray, I'm not your enemy. I have been trying to protect your dignity here. But you can't stand in the kitchen and accuse me of manipulating a 7-year-old and then act surprised when I say I'm worried about you. I looked at my daughter. Corinne had a towel folded in half in her hands, and she was looking at the towel. Corinne, I said. Dad, barely audible. Maybe you did mishear. I have been in rooms where men were sentenced to prison. Friends. I have never heard a room go as quiet as my kitchen went right then. Trent stood up. He came around the table, and he put his hand on my shoulder like a priest, and he said, Ray, I think if you can't be reasonable about this, maybe you should stay at a hotel for a couple nights. Get some space. Come back when you're clear. I looked at his hand on my shoulder until he took it off. Say that again, I said. I said maybe you should stay somewhere else. In whose house? He smiled a little, like I'd made his point for him. See, that's the thing about this attitude. It's a simple question, I said. Whose house? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I turned around and I walked down the hall to my bedroom. And I closed the door behind me the way Arlene always insisted a person should close a door when they are truly angry. Softly, on purpose. So, the latch is the loudest thing in the room. And I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I took out the legal pad, and I wrote the date, the time, and every word I could reconstruct, in order, the way I'd done 10,000 times for the state of Minnesota. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking right now, because I've heard it from every person who's ever heard this story. You're thinking, Ray, why didn't you put them out that same night? It's your house. Change the locks. I'll tell you exactly why, and I want you to hear it, because it's the most important thing I know. Because the second I acted out of anger instead of evidence, I would have handed that man the exact story he was already writing. Volatile, erratic, threw his own daughter and grandchild into the street at 10 at night. Every hearing I ever transcribed, the family member who got the guardianship was the one holding the calm folder, and the person who lost was the one who'd made a scene. I couldn't afford to be right, friends. I had to be documented. So the first thing I did was not throw anybody out. The first thing I did was call Gene Potocek. Gene had been an elder law attorney in that courthouse for 30 years, and I'd taken down probably 400 hours of his voice. He took my call on a Tuesday morning and told me to come in Thursday at 1. His office was above a bakery on Superior Street, and it smelled permanently like bread, which I've always thought is an unfair advantage in a lawyer. He was 74 now, and he'd gone completely white, but he still listened the way he always had. Absolutely still. No nodding, no mum-hum, just total attention with a pen in his hand. I told him everything, and I laid the legal pad on his desk. He read for a long time. Then he took off his glasses. Ray, he said, how is the house titled? Sole owner. Bought in '88. Arlene was on it until she passed. It reverted to me. No mortgage since 2009. Corinne's name has never been on anything. Lease with them? Anything written? Anything verbal about rent? Nothing. I told them to come stay. Gene put his glasses back on. Then here's your position, and it's better than you think. They are not tenants. There's no lease, no rent, no consideration. They're guests occupying with your permission, and permission is a thing you granted, and a thing you can revoke. That's not a divorce, it's not a family negotiation, it's a property matter, and it is entirely yours to decide. How fast? Written notice. Dated, delivered properly, keep proof. If they leave, it's over. If they refuse, we file, and a judge sorts it out. And no judge in this county is going to be confused about who owns the house. He tapped the desk once. Now listen to me, because this is the part people get wrong and it costs them everything. Until that date passes, you do not touch one lock on that house. Not one. You don't shut off the heat, you don't move their belongings, you don't take a door off its hinges. The day you do that, you stop being the owner enforcing his rights, and you start being the angry old man, and he will have exactly what he needs. Understood. Second thing. Jean leaned back. The occupancy is the small problem. The guardianship is the real one. Has he actually taken steps? I don't know. Find out. Because if he petitions first, we're on defense, and defense is expensive and slow and humiliating. And Ray. He looked at me over the glasses in a way I hadn't seen since a courtroom. You are going to want to prove you're fine by being angry about it. Don't. Be boring. Be dull. Be the most tediously competent man in Minnesota and put it all on paper. I drove home with the window cracked and the lake flat and gray on my left, and for the first time in 9 days I could breathe all the way down. Now, before I tell you what he did next, and it's worse than what he'd done so far, do me a favor and drop a 1 or a 2 in the comments right now. Type a 1 if you think Trent had already gone as far as he was going to go. Type a 2 if you think he was just getting started. I'll tell you which it was in a few minutes, and I'll say this. Most people guess wrong, and the ones who guess right usually guess right because they've lived it. The escalation started small, and it started with objects. My reading glasses went missing off the arm of the chair and turned up in the refrigerator door in the butter compartment, and Trent found them, and he made sure Corinne was standing right there when he did. He didn't say a word about it. He just held them up with a look of enormous sorrow and put them gently on the counter. 2 weeks later, my keys were in the freezer. Then the back door was standing open at 6 in the morning with the storm door swinging, and when I came out, he was already on the phone in the driveway saying, "No, he's fine. He's fine. It's just the third time," to somebody he never identified. I want you to know that I checked myself, friends. Honestly, that's what a thing like this does to a man. I sat in the garage at 2 in the morning and asked myself whether an old fellow who's certain he didn't do something is exactly the sort who would have. So I bought a spiral-bound calendar, the cheap kind, and every single night I wrote where my glasses were, where my keys were, whether I'd locked the doors, and whether I'd used the stove. Every night. 51 nights running. Not one entry ever matched his version. Not one. The 4th week, he went after the barometer. Arlene's father brought a brass ship's barometer back from Norway in 1958, and it hung by the front door for the entire time we lived in that house. And I tapped the glass every morning of my life, the way her father had done and the way she had done. It was the first sound of my day. I came home from the hardware store on a Thursday, and it was in 3 pieces on the entry table, and Trent was standing there with the mounting screws in his palm, and he said, "Ray, I want you to know it's okay. It was on there loose. I've been meaning to fix it, and you didn't do anything wrong. But it did come off in your hand this morning, and you set it down and walked away." I had not touched it. I had not been in that hallway. I looked at the brass face, cracked corner to corner, and I did not raise my voice and I did not accuse him, and here's why. Because I understood in that moment that anger was not a byproduct of what he was doing. Anger was the product. He was mining me for it. He wanted one afternoon of me shouting in front of a witness, and every single thing he did was a shovel. So I said, "Thank you for picking up the pieces." And I carried them into my bedroom in both hands, and I put them in a shoebox on the closet shelf, and I wrote it down. He escalated once more, and this one nearly broke me. 2nd week of June, a Sunday. Family dinner, which by then was a performance nobody had the courage to cancel. Junie was next to me. Corinne was pushing green beans around her plate. Trent had his phone face up on the table by his water glass, which by then I had learned to notice, and he said, in the friendliest voice in the world, "Junie, honey, tell Mom what you told me about Grandpa this week." The fork stopped in my hand. Junie looked at her plate, then at her father, then at me. She was 7 years old, friends, and I watched a 7-year-old carry the entire weight of a grown man's plan across a dinner table. "Grandpa forgets things," she said. Nobody spoke. Trent picked up his water and drank and set it down and let the silence do the work. Junie's chin started to go. She looked at me, and this is the part I'll take with me. She looked at me with her whole face, asking me to tell her whether she'd done a good thing or a terrible one. And I understood that if I defended myself right then, in front of her, I would be making that child choose between her father and her grandfather in the middle of a Sunday dinner, and whichever way she chose it would leave a mark on her for 50 years. So I put my hand over her small hand on the tablecloth and I said, You know what, kiddo? Sometimes I do. Everybody does a little. Eat your beans. And she breathed out, and the room let go. And Trent looked at me for a good 4 seconds, with an expression I can only describe as recalculating. That night I sat in the garage next to the canoe until almost 2 in the morning, and I'm not too proud to tell you that I cried out there, which I had not done since the March Arlene died. Not because of what he'd done to me, because of what it cost her to say it. And then I wiped my face and I went inside and I got on the computer and I did what Jean told me to do. I stopped being the accused. I started being the record. Answer to the poll, by the way. It was a 2. It was always a 2. The first crack in his story came from a woman named Delia Fontaine, Mrs. Fontaine was Junie's second-grade teacher, and she called the house on a Tuesday in late June and asked for me specifically, which she made a point of saying was unusual, and asked whether I could come in. I sat across a low table from her in a classroom full of tiny chairs, and she folded her hands and said she was going to be careful with her words. Mr. Whitaker, I want to be clear that I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm telling you what a child in my care has said to me, and I'm documenting it, and I'd have done this for any student. Go ahead. Junie has told me 3 times since April that you forget things. Unprompted, out of nowhere, in the middle of unrelated conversations. The first time I thought nothing of it. The third time, it was word for word identical to the first. Children don't do that. Children ramble. No, I said. They don't repeat verbatim unless somebody gave them the sentence. That was my thought as well. She glanced at a small notepad, her own record. I noticed, and I respected it enormously. Last week, I asked her privately, with the door open, whether anyone had told her to say it. She said, and I wrote it down, Dad says I have to say it or Grandpa could get hurt and it would be my fault. The classroom was very warm and very quiet and full of construction paper suns. Then she put both hands over her mouth, Mrs. Fontaine said, and asked if she was in trouble. And Mr. Whitaker, I want you to know what I told her. I said nobody who tells the truth is ever in trouble in my classroom. I had to take a moment. I've filed a written summary with our counselor, she went on. Our policy requires it. If this continues, the county gets a call, and I'd rather you hear that from me now than be surprised by it later. Coaching a child to make false statements about an adult isn't a family disagreement. There's a name for what it does to a 7-year-old. I'd like a copy of that summary, I said. Signed. She looked at me for a second, and I saw her decide something. I'll have it to you Friday. I got it Friday. It went in the folder. The second crack came from my neighbor, Hollis Bergstrom, who is 81 and misses nothing. Hollis stopped me at the end of the driveway one evening and said, Ray, your son-in-law came over here in May and asked me if I'd noticed you wandering. Wandering, his word. Asked if I'd be willing to say so in writing. Hollis spat into the grass, which is the strongest editorial position he has. I told him the only wandering you do is out to that garage at all hours. And if that's a crime, put me in the cell next to you. Hollis, would you put that in writing? What he asked you? He wrote it out that night in blue ballpoint on lined paper and signed it and dated it, and his wife notarized it, because she's been a notary since 1994. That folder was getting heavy, friends, and then I did the thing that ended it. I called Dr. Ruth Amato, a neuropsychologist at the clinic on 4th Street, and I paid out of my own pocket for a full battery. Not a screening. The whole thing. 4.5 hours across 2 mornings. Memory, executive function, processing speed, verbal fluency. The works. I want to be honest about something. I was terrified. I sat in that parking lot before the first session with my hands on the wheel and thought, what if he's right by accident? He was not. I scored in the 91st percentile for my age band. Above average for men 20 years younger on verbal recall, which Dr. Amado said with a straight face was probably an occupational injury from 34 years of writing down other people's sentences. I asked her for the full written report, signed, dated, on letterhead, and I had my signature on the release, notarized at the credit union. Then I went back to Gene Potachik with all of it, and I told him about the second thing. I want a trust for Junie. Gene put his pen down. Tell me what you're thinking. Everything I have was going to Corinne. I want it restructured. The house, the accounts, all of it goes into a living trust. Junie's the beneficiary for education and medical, and there's a corporate trustee, not a family member, and Trent Dolan does not get within a mile of it. Revocable or irrevocable? You tell me. I'll tell you what a lot of men in your chair want, Jean said. They want irrevocable, because irrevocable feels like slamming a door. It feels final, and it feels like justice. He shook his head slowly. Ray, you're 71, and you're healthy. What happens if you need long-term care at 84? What happens if Corinne gets out of this marriage and becomes exactly the woman you raised and you want to change your mind? Irrevocable means the man you'll be in 10 years doesn't get a vote. I don't like taking rights away from my clients, and that includes taking them away from their future selves. Revocable, then. Revocable, with a corporate trustee, an independent successor, and a hard reserve carved out for your own care that never touches Junie's side. He started writing. And Ray, do this next part right. When a man restructures his estate in the middle of a family fight, somebody eventually stands up and says he wasn't competent when he signed it. So we're going to sign it in front of Dr. Amado's report, with witnesses, with a notary, and we're going to make that folder so boring and so airtight that no attorney in this state would take the case. I signed on a Thursday morning in the last week of July, with 3 witnesses and a notary, and Arlene's photograph from 1986 sitting in my jacket pocket, which nobody knew about but me. Before I tell you how it ended, I want one more thing from you, friends, because this is the question I've never been able to answer myself, and I'd honestly like to know what you think. Type an A in the comments if you believe Corinne knew what her husband was doing. Type a B if you believe she genuinely didn't. Go on and put it down before I tell you the rest, because after this, you won't be able to unhear it. August 9th. I set it up myself. I didn't wait for a doorbell, and I didn't wait to be cornered. I told Corinne and Trent that there'd be a family meeting Saturday at 10 in the kitchen, and that it wasn't optional. Trent smiled about it all week. I think he believed I was finally going to fall apart in a room, and that he'd get it on his phone. Saturday at 10, they came down the stairs and found Jean Pitacek at my kitchen table in a gray suit with a briefcase open, and a notary named Angela from his office with her stamp already out, and a manila folder 4 inches thick sitting in front of my chair. Trent stopped in the doorway. I watched the smile go through about 3 stages before it came off entirely. Corinne said, "Dad?" "Sit down, sweetheart," I said. "Both of you." Jean went first, because that's how you do it. He read the notice of revocation of permission to occupy, dated and prepared for proper service, 30 days, effective September 8th. He explained, in that flat, unhurried courthouse voice, the difference between a tenant and a guest, and that no lease had ever existed, and that no rent had ever been paid, and that permission granted by an owner may be withdrawn by that owner. Trent came up out of the chair. "This is elder manipulation. He's not competent to—" "Sit down, Mr. Dolan," Jean said, without raising his voice a hair. "You're going to want to hear the next part." And I opened the folder. I read Dr. Amado's report first. 91st percentile. Signed, dated, notarized. Then Mrs. Fontaine's written summary, including the sentence, "Dad says I have to say it or Grandpa could get hurt, and it would be my fault." Then Hollis Bergstrom's notarized statement about being asked to say I wandered. Then 51 consecutive nights of a spiral calendar with the locations of my glasses, my keys, my doors, and my stove in my handwriting, dated. Then the legal pad. 22 entries. Times, dates, direct quotes. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycle. Corinne had both hands flat on the table, and she was not looking at her husband. She was looking at the folder like it was something that had crawled in from outside. Trent said, "Ray, come on, Ray. You've taken a couple of misunderstandings and you've built a— You spent 5 months building a record that says I can't be trusted with my own life," I said. "I spent 5 months building the answer. Mine is signed, dated, and notarized. Yours is a 7-year-old you taught to lie." He looked at Corinne. And friends, this was the moment. This right here. He looked at my daughter for backup, the way he had looked at her in that kitchen back in April, and this time she did not give it to him. She said, very quietly, "You told me he mishears things. Core, You told me he mishears things. Her voice broke open. I stood in this kitchen, and I told my father he was mishearing. I stood up then, because there was one more piece and I wanted to be on my feet for it. The house, the accounts, and everything I own went into a trust 2 weeks ago, I said. It's revocable, I hold the strings, and there's a professional trustee and an independent successor. Junie is the beneficiary for education and medical care. Corinne, you can be added later if the day ever comes, when I believe you're free. Trent, you are not in that document anywhere, and you never will be, and if you contest it, the file you'll be contesting is the one I just read you. He said several things after that. I'm not going to repeat them, partly because they were ugly, and partly because they were, at long last, loud, and the loudness told me everything. I excused myself and I walked out the back door. Junie was on the porch steps in her chest shirt with the notebook on her knees. Hey, kiddo, I said. Want to help me get the varnish on the canoe? She took my hand without asking a single question, and we went out to the garage, and we left the door open so the smell wouldn't build up, and while a lawyer and a notary sat in my kitchen doing the hardest work of that month, I taught my granddaughter how to lay down a coat of spar varnish with the grain and never against it. She asked me why you have to sand between every coat. I told her because each layer has to be honest with the one under it, or the whole thing peels in a year. They were out by the 29th of August, 10 days ahead of the deadline. I never had to file anything, and I never touched a lock until the truck was gone. And here's what I want to tell you about that afternoon, friends. Because if you're waiting for the part where I felt good, it isn't coming. I stood at the front window and watched Trent's car back out of my driveway with a mattress strapped to the roof. And what came up in me wasn't relief, and it sure wasn't victory. It was grief. Plain, clean grief for the version of my family that should have existed in that house and never got the chance. I had won every single thing I set out to win, and I sat down on the stairs in my empty hallway and put my head in my hands. Corinne left him in October. She called me from a motel in Superior at 11 at night, and the first thing she said was, "Dad, was he always like that, or did I let him become it?" And I told her the truth, which is that I don't know, and that it isn't the useful question. The useful question is what she does starting now. She apologized. It took her 9 minutes to get through it, and I didn't interrupt once, because I've spent my whole working life letting people finish their sentences. She and Junie moved into a 2-bedroom on Piedmont in November. I helped carry the boxes, and on a Saturday in December, with the lake iced up along the edges and the snow coming in that fine, dry way it does up here, Junie came out to the garage, where I was rubbing the last coat down with a cloth, and she held out her composition notebook. "It's for you," she said. "It's the true things." I opened it. Pages and pages of small pencil handwriting going back 2 years. The lake is colder in July than people think. Mrs. Fontaine sneezes 4 times. And then, near the back, in April, Grandpa can still lift the canoe by himself. And under it, from June, in shakier writing, Dad says I have to say Grandpa forgets. I don't think it's true. I'm writing it here, so it stays somewhere. I had to set it down on the workbench and hold on to the edge for a second. "Junie," I said, "do you know what you did?" I wrote it down. "You kept the record, kiddo." My voice was not steady and I didn't try to make it. When somebody tried to change what was true, you kept the record. Grown men in courtrooms can't manage that. She thought about it. Then she pointed at the plumb bob, still hanging off that nail where I'd left it in April. "Like the string," she said. "Just exactly like the string. We put the canoe in the water in May. It floated true. Her grandmother's father built it in 1962 and it did not leak one drop. Now let me say the part I've been working my way toward for this whole story, because I don't want you to think I came out of this without anything on my own hands. I was not a perfect father. I was quiet in a family that needed me to be plain. When Corinne first brought that man around and I had a bad feeling in my stomach, I said nothing, because I told myself it wasn't my place, and because peace felt cheaper than honesty. It wasn't cheaper. I just paid for it later, and I paid for it with interest, and so did a 7-year-old girl. If I could go back, I'd say the hard thing early, kindly, out loud, one time, and let it land where it landed. Don't wait, friends. Don't wait for a folder. Say it while it's small. And here's the rest of what I learned at 71 years old, and I'd like you to take it with you today. Your dignity is not something your children grant you. It's not something a doctor confirms or a judge awards. It's yours. And the only way to lose it is to hand it over one small surrender at a time, because you're afraid of a scene. And when somebody starts trying to rewrite who you are, and if you live long enough, somebody will, you do not win that fight by shouting louder. You win it by being so calm and so thorough and so relentlessly, boringly accurate that the truth has somewhere to stand. The truth deserves a witness. Be the witness. Write it down, date it, sign it. Because memory is soft, friends, and the record is hard, and the person holding the record is the person who decides what happened. If this story moves something in you today, if you've lived it, or you love somebody who's living it right now, leave a comment below and tell me about it. Send it to the person you thought about while you were listening. And if you believe an old man's word ought to be worth as much as a young man's story, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. It matters more than you know. One last note. Some stories on this channel contain fictional elements, shaped only to carry a lesson worth hearing. If that's not for you, no hard feelings at all. Go find what does speak to you. And if you're still here, I'll see you next time.